Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a story that feels exactly like a Hollywood political thriller, except it's actual ancient history. We're looking at the staggering wealth, the massive geopolitical blunders, and the incredibly rapid collapse of King Solomon's ancient empire. And you know, this isn't just some dusty story about antiquity. It is a profound study in power, alliances, and what happens when leadership completely loses its way.
$3,836,160,000. Based on the source materials calculations using figures from the Open Bible, that massive number represents the estimated modern equivalent of Solomon's yearly gold income. And keep in mind, we're not talking about a sprawling global superpower here. This was for a nation roughly the size of the modern U.S. state of New Jersey. It is an almost incomprehensible concentration of wealth.
Which brings us to the core mystery we're unraveling today. How in the world did an empire with that kind of unimaginable wealth, a strategic geographic position, and a literal divine promise manage to lose absolutely all of it in just a single generation? Well, let's dive into this. We're going to explore the fascinating historical irony of an empire that was built on a mountain of gold, but ultimately destroyed by extreme hubris and a fundamental betrayal of its own core principles.
So let's set the stage. Picture this. You're building for 2 solid decades. First, 7 years to construct the Grand Temple, and then another 13 years just for Solomon's own royal palace and apartments. So after 20 years of non-stop construction, Solomon hits his absolute peak in his 24th year. It's right at this moment that God appears to him and promises him perpetual rule over Israel. But there's one massive condition attached. He has to remain faithful.
But our source text notes a reoccurring, almost tragic biblical pattern. We can call it the promise paradox. It seems like whenever a major figure receives a divine promise, the very next thing they do is ruin it by breaking the rules. It's essentially an ancient hold my beer moment. I mean, Adam did it, Abraham did it by committing polygamy right after God promised him a son, David did it with Bathsheba, and right on cue, Solomon falls into the exact same trap.
The fascinating thing here is that the rules for kings weren't some heavily guarded secret. Moses had explicitly laid out 3 very specific prohibitions for any future kings of Israel in Deuteronomy. They were instructed not to multiply gold, not to reduce the people to servitude to build up a war machine, specifically regarding horses, and absolutely not to commit polygamy. And yet, shortly after receiving his grand promise, Solomon systematically and dramatically breaks every single one of these conditions. Let's look at that first broken rule, gold. Solomon hoarded it to an absurd degree. The text notes he took in 666 talents of gold a year. If you do the math on that, it is roughly 25 tons, or 800,000 ounces, pouring into a country the size of New Jersey every single year. That's enough to boggle the mind. It was an unprecedented hoarding of wealth that directly violated the mandate to keep the monarchy grounded.
And what do you even do with all that gold? Well, it definitely wasn't just sitting quietly in a vault. The text tells us Solomon used 600 shekels of gold per piece to forge 200 massive ceremonial shields out of beaten gold. Whenever he walked across the pavement from his royal palace to the temple, his guards would carry these shields, creating a blinding, literal glory cloud right around the king. It was the ultimate ancient flex, just a massive display of royal ego and excess.
But you know, hoarding gold was just the beginning of the end. The real disaster unfolded in his foreign policy. To understand this colossal failure, the source contrasts Solomon's treatment of 2 very different leaders, Hiram, the king of Tyre, who was a proven and loyal friend, versus the Pharaoh of Egypt, a historically dangerous and manipulative entity.
Let's look at Hiram of Tyre first. Now, Hiram was a dedicated ally. He loved Solomon's father David, and he was clearly a converted man who shared Israel's faith. When Solomon took the throne, Hiram couldn't do enough to help out. He actively volunteered his resources to build the temple and showered Solomon with gifts. Really, if there was any nation Solomon should have valued, it was Tyre. Yet Solomon completely took Hiram for granted, eventually just tossing him a cheap, insulting present in return that deeply offended his absolute most loyal ally.
To frame this dynamic, our source material actually draws a really interesting modern political parallel. Impartially analyzing the situation, the text compares Solomon's treatment of Hiram to how the Reagan and Bush administrations historically treated their loyal conservative basis. The source points out that they essentially took their supporters for granted, assuming they were already in their pocket, while simultaneously exhausting their resources to pursue the goodwill of their political opposition. It's just a timeless political miscalculation, right? Neglecting your true allies because you just assume they're never going to leave you. So, if he's ignoring his friends, who did Solomon court instead? Egypt. He married Pharaoh's daughter, boom, breaking the polygamy rule. He built temples to foreign gods to appease his wives, and he established this massive horse trading enterprise, which directly violated the command against building a war machine and explicitly trading with the Egyptians. And this leads to a brilliantly fatal chain of events. Solomon breaks the rules to get Egyptian horses. Then he acts as a middleman, selling those horses over to Syria. Well, shortly after, a new, highly hostile regime takes over Syria, and guess what they use to attack Israel? Yep, the exact same horses Solomon just sold them. By building an unauthorized war machine for pure profit, he literally armed his own enemies.
And what about his great new father-in-law, the Pharaoh? Well, he wasn't exactly a loyal buddy. He was playing a much longer, far more ruthless game. The text reveals Pharaoh's policy was to play all sides at once. While smiling right at Solomon, Pharaoh was secretly harboring and nurturing Solomon's enemies right there in the Egyptian court. For example, the Edomite prince Hadad, who had fled from David years earlier, was nurtured by Pharaoh and eventually sent right back to make trouble for Solomon.
Meanwhile, back home, the glittering illusion was cracking fast. Funding all this golden glory and geopolitical chess had a devastating cost. Defying Moses' rules yet again, Solomon actually reduced his own people to forced labor. He utilized conscription, levied heavy taxes, and forced the citizens of Israel into a standing army. The sheer, crushing weight of funding this empire fell directly onto the backs of everyday citizens.
As you'd expect, this immense burden turned the entire nation into a pressure cooker. The citizens were just completely exhausted by the endless building projects. The powerful Ephraimite tribe deeply resented being heavily taxed by a Judahite king. So when an overseer named Jeroboam found out through a prophecy that he was actually destined to rule 10 of the tribes, Solomon put a massive target on his back. Jeroboam fled for his life, and guess where he went? Straight into the protective arms of Pharaoh down in Egypt.
And this sets off the final catastrophic chain reaction. In the year AM 3029, Solomon dies. His son, Rehoboam, arrogantly refuses the people's plea for tax relief. So, the very next year, 10 northern tribes secede, completely splitting the nation in half. And then, smelling blood in the water by year 5 of Rehoboam's reign, Egypt finally makes its move. Here is the ultimate heartbreaking irony. Pharaoh, the very leader Solomon sacrificed his faith and his true friends to court, invades Judah. Egypt strips Jerusalem bare, taking absolutely all of it, right down to those 200 ceremonial gold shields. Talk about a brutal downgrade. Solomon's son literally had to replace his father's magnificent golden glory cloud with cheap bronze replicas. It is just a profound historical masterclass on the absolute dangers of hubris. Solomon completely ignored his true allies to curry favor with his enemies, and he destroyed his nation's wealth and unity in the process. It leaves us with a timeless question that applies to any era. When a leader takes their friends for granted just to court their enemies, who truly pays the price? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I hope this helped illuminate the incredibly fascinating history behind the fall of Solomon's empire.